We're going to learn a magnificent Rashi Sikha today, where the Rebbe analyzes Rashi's explanation of Eisav's love towards his brother Yaakov and how it was really insincere. But what the Rebbe does is he builds up a whole methodical approach to trying to understand the various components that Rashi teaches us, only to explain in really practical terms that you have to think of the context of what was going on in Eisav's emotional state at the time. This is going to teach us not only clarity about Rashi's message and why he words things a little differently to some of the classical sources, but also a very powerful take-home lesson for all of us. The pasuk, it all starts with the pasuk that says, "Vayoratz Eisav likros," so that Eisav ran to greet Yaakov, Vayichabekehu, and he embraced him, Vayipol atzavari, Vayishlach, and he fell on his neck and he kissed him, Vayifku, and the two of them cried. Pirush Rashi. So firstly, Rashi explains al Vayichabkehu. What does it mean when it says that Eisav embraced Yaakov? He says, Nisgalgalu rachamov, it aroused his compassion. Kisher ra'ahu, very important, there was a catalyst that made Eisav feel compassionate towards Yaakov, and that is Kisher ra'ahu mishtachve kol hishtachavois halolu, where he saw him bowing and bowing and bowing, as the Torah has just described. That invoked mercy from Eisav, and therefore he hugged him. Then Rashi explains the word Vayishlach, that he kissed him, and he says, Nokadolov, look in the Torah, you'll see the dots on top of all of the letters of the word Vayishlach. And says Rashi, there are two views as to why that is. And where are these two views found? Bebraisa de Sifri, in the Braisa of the Sifri. Yes, one opinion is, why are they dots? To distract us from the literal meaning of the word and to tell us that Eisav was insincere when he kissed his brother. Rabbi then says, it's a well-established legal principle in Judaism that Eisav hates Yaakov, always. But something happened here. At that time, he was suddenly aroused with a sense of compassion. Therefore, he kissed him wholeheartedly. So it sounds like the first opinion says insincere kiss, and the second opinion says sincere kiss. So now we have a whole string of questions. First of all, why does Rashi, when he tells us about the motivation behind Eisav embracing Yaakov, Rashi aligns that with what's going to be the second explanation of Vayishlach? In other words, that it is sincere. His compassion was aroused. And Rashi does nothing to explain how the first opinion, who believes the kiss was insincere, how would that opinion interpret the hug? Doesn't tell us. But it would be a really difficult answer to suggest that Rashi because Rashi is about to explain this. He doesn't have to explain it in the case of Vayichabkehu, because he's about to explain Vayishlach, that the first opinion about the kiss that Eisav gives to Yaakov is that it was not full-hearted. And we should then extrapolate that the hug was also not wholehearted. Because the word Vayishlach has those dots, which the Torah put there deliberately to draw our attention to the fact that it's not to be taken at face value, which does not exist in the context of the hug that Eisav gave him. So we can't just relate the interpretation of Vayishlach to Vayichabkehu. And if we can't, then Rashi should have given us two views of Eisav, one of which matches the first opinion of Vayishlach, that it was completely insincere, exactly as he did in the case of Vayishlach. Okay, so that is the big question we have on Vayichabkehu. Why is there only one interpretation? Why doesn't Rashi match it up with the two views about Vayishlach? Now let's look at what Rashi says about Vayishlach. Now that we're at the next one, where Rashi explains the word Vayishlach. So if the first pasuk about the embrace, Rashi was satisfied with a single explanation, how come when it comes to the kiss that Eisav gives to Yaakov, now he feels the need to give us two explanations? It's not only two explanations in the most generic sense, two explanations which, as we're about to see, Rashi says are of equal value. The fact that Rashi introduces us by saying there are those who argue as to what the significance of Vayishlach is. Anytime that Rashi tells us that there are two views, the impression Rashi wants to create is that there are two equally valid views, at least from a perspective of Pshat. Typically, when Rashi brings two or more opinions, without telling us in advance there are going to be different opinions, then usually what Rashi does is he tells us first the one that is the easiest to fit within the context of the Pshat, the simple understanding of the Pasuk, and then he'll tell us the one that's a little bit more difficult to fit into the Pshat. But in a situation like ours, where Rashi introduces by saying that there are views on this particular opinion, this particular pasuk, or any other similar language, even though that really is information that seems like Rashi didn't have to tell us, because we'll work it out. If there's two opinions, they obviously argue. That's because Rashi wants us to know that both opinions are equally valid in the context of Pshat. Now, when we examine the two opinions on Vayishlach, it does not seem that they're both equally close to the Pshat. Let's have a look. The first opinion, which is that Vayishlach is not a real kiss because of the dots on top of the word. That's a much easier explanation to accept, because the purpose of those dots is to distract us from the words and help us realize there's something else. The Rabbi puts it this way: it's somewhere between writing and erasing a word. So in other words, it's drawing our attention to the fact that don't read it at face value. And there are various other examples of places in the Torah where there are dots above letters, which the Sifri quotes, where the Sifri says are similar to this one. And in all of those cases, the objective of those dots is that we read the pasuk and don't take it at face value. That fits perfectly with the pshat. Vayishlach literally means he kissed him. Now there's dots. He didn't really kiss him. Makes perfect sense. But from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's point of view, what are the dots detracting from the word? He wants to tell us that he did kiss him sincerely. If Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's point is correct, that actually Eisav was sincere when he kissed his brother, then we don't need dots on the words, because Vayishlach means Vayishlach. That's the meaning of the words. So clearly it would appear that the first explanation is closer to Pshat. Why does Rashi indicate that they're both equal in the Pshat? So the commentaries try to give us an explanation. It's a bit of a convoluted explanation. The Rebbe is not going to accept it. That's actually what Rashi is referring to. That's why he has to tell us. It's halacha that Eisav saying to Yaakov. The default position of Eisav is to hate Yaakov. So I don't need anybody to tell me by putting dots on top of the word that Eisav didn't kiss Yaakov sincerely, because he would never kiss him sincerely because he hates him. It's self-understood. And therefore say the Mefarshim, actually Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is flipping it the other way around. That the dots on top of Vayishlach are to tell you, despite the fact that usually Eisav kisses with insincere intentions, here it was actually sincere. So in other words, it's the nikud that helps us actually understand this. The only problem is, that doesn't fit the rule of how dots on top of words work in Torah. Again, using the Rabbi's expression, there's a word which is semi-erased by the dots above it. In other words, the word is weakened in its meaning. Here, we're not weakening the word kiss, we're actually highlighting that kiss means kiss. We're strengthening and highlighting this word, Vayishlach, he actually kissed him, even though you don't expect it from Eisav. Because that's completely different to any other place in the Torah where we have this principle of more dots than letters. Even Rashi himself will give us many examples where the dots above words are there to minimize the typical interpretation of those words. So why does Rashi quote that second opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? And even say that it sounds equal to the first, makes it sound like it's of equal value to the first interpretation. Our simple appreciation of the pasuk does not sound like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's interpretation is as pashut as the first interpretation. You'll say, because Rashi's quoting the Brisa in the Sifri, and it has both opinions. That's not reason enough. The golden rule of Rashi is he will not quote something from a source unless the particulars that he's quoting are relevant to the pshat, and we can't say that the only reason he's quoting Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is because he is the second view in Sifri. Doesn't matter. If it's not relevant to the pasuk, to the pshat of the pasuk, Rashi is not going to quote it. So, Vayichabkei, why does Rashi only give us one interpretation and not two? Vayishlach, why do we need two interpretations, and why does Rashi indicate that they're both equally close to the pshat when they don't seem to be that way? Furthermore, more questions. Rashi is quoting over here from the Sifri, but the truth is he had at least two other choices of where to quote from, and some of those other choices might have been a better fit for what Rashi wants to tell us in Pshat. Why does Rashi specifically quote the version in the Sifri? And then told us where it's from, so we'll know that he's being specific. It could have looked at the Medrash Bereishis Rabbah on this pasuk, where you have the same kind of debate. Why did he choose this one? Okay, you'll say, go look in Bereishis Rabbah. It's not identical to what Rashi is trying to tell us. So you could say the reason he doesn't quote the two views of Bereishis Rabbah is because the second view in Bereishis Rabbah, so the first view is exactly as we've got, but the second view is Das Rabbi Yanai that actually Eisav never intended to kiss Yaakov. You've probably heard this medrash. He wanted to bite Yaakov on the neck. And Yaakov Avinu's neck became hard as marble, and therefore he couldn't do it. Now that we'll all agree is far from Pshat. Rashi is going to avoid that kind of interpretation because it's really distant from the Pshat. Plus, they were completely removing the meaning of the word Vayishlach. There is no kiss at all. Rashi would prefer to say that we're weakening the word Vayishlach because that's what dots normally do. And so therefore it's an insincere kiss. But to go as radical as to say there was no kiss at all despite the Torah saying Vayishlach, that's beyond the pale of Pshat. So fine, so Rashi wasn't going to quote Rabbi Yanai, but Rashi could have quoted the first opinion in Bereishis Rabbah, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who says, Melamed, this pasuk Vayishlach teaches us that Eisav was suddenly aroused to have compassion for Yaakov, and therefore he kissed him full-heartedly. And that matches Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Especially seeing as Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is the one who teaches this principle that you always pay attention to the dots in order to reinterpret the word if there are a whole lot of dots. That's how in this Medrash Bereishis Rabbah, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar starts the conversation, and that's something which something Rashi has quoted numerous times before. So you would actually expect Rashi to select Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. The first opinion he's leaving as a nameless opinion anyway. So bringing Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar from the Bereishis Rabbah, why go with Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai from the Sifri? But the easiest quote should have been Avos Rabbi Nosson, because that seems the most succinct. Remember, Rashi likes to be succinct. Both opinions are in Avos Rabbi Nosson, and they are clear and concise. Eisav didn't kiss him wholeheartedly. First opinion Rashi quotes Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar oimer, so that's great because that also fits with the Bereishis Rabbah, the same opinion. Neshika zoi shel emes, this kiss was a true, sincere kiss, v'kol einon shel emes, as opposed to all the others. Okay, so now let's summarize the questions we have on Rashi at this point. Our questions are as follows. Why is Rashi specific? To use the language of Sifri, not Avos Rabbi Nosson, and certainly not the Medrash. Why do we have to know where the source is? Gimel, the other question. Why does Rashi have to tell us who the opinion is that says that it was a sincere kiss? Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Rashi typically does not quote the Baal HaMaimer unless it's going to help us understand things better. Last question, Daled. Why does Rashi have to introduce his interpretation, or at least Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's opinion, by saying there is this axiomatic principle that Eisav hates Yaakov? Why is that going to change our understanding of the Pshat in this particular pasuk? Of course, it's a valuable thing to know generically, but in this pasuk, the language that Rashi uses, and even the Medrash uses, is everybody agrees that even if it was a sincere kiss, it's that Eisav was aroused to mercy then, in that context, in that moment. Implying that Eisav hated Yaakov before the kiss, and he continued to hate Yaakov after the kiss. You don't have to tell me halacha b'yaduash Eisav son Yaakov. So now the Rebbe is going to present a potential way to answer all of these questions. And it's actually a beautiful explanation, but it's not going to be to the Rebbe's satisfaction. We can answer as follows. The first thing is we have to know, if Rashi is telling us that both opinions on Vayishlach are yesh cholkim, meaning they were both close to pshat, what we can also say is they both agree that the role of the dots over the word Vayishlach is to undermine or weaken the typical meaning of Vayishlach. Question is, what does that mean? Does it mean that it's teaching us he didn't kiss Yaakov full-heartedly? Is it telling us the concept of kiss is being weakened by the dots, so the kiss is not full? Has a different opinion. Where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, no, it's not weakening the meaning of the word kiss in its generic form. It is weakening the meaning of this interaction. Who kissed who? That it's Eisav kissing Yaakov. That's what's being weakened. In other words, because we know that Eisav hates Yaakov. If we didn't have the dots, we'd say, we know the context. It's Eisav kissing Yaakov. That cannot be a sincere kiss. He hates him. So therefore the dots here weaken the context of hatred in this kiss, so that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai can actually say, guess what? In this moment, this kiss was with an arousal of compassion, and it was actually sincere. And if you think about it, according to the first opinion, actually you'd think the dots only apply to the word Vayishlach. The fact that it's Vayishlach who supports Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's opinion, actually. Move on. The first thing we say is, now we know that both opinions are coming from the same perspective. The dots weaken how we're supposed to understand the word. Dots are there to weaken the typical understanding of the word with the dots on them. So that explains why Rashi would say that they're both equally pshat. Number two, would also explain why Rashi brings two opinions on Vayishlach. Why? Because when you go with the first opinion, you would expect the dots only to be on the letters of the word Vayishlach, because we want to weaken the message of kissing. Whereas Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai explains why there's dots on every single letter. So in other words, as we'll see in a second, whenever you have two opinions and they're both equal in pshat, it could be that they're equally good, or it could be that they equally have a weak point. So this would be the weak point of the first opinion. The dots don't measure up to the word that you're trying to interpret. Gimel, now we'll also understand why Rashi wanted to quote the Sifri, and not the one in obviously Rabbi Nassan, even though it's much more concise. Because it's the language of the Sifri that's going to help us understand. The context for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is that this is a Vayishlach. It's a kiss between somebody who hates the other person. But here, suddenly he was overwhelmed by emotion and he kissed him with his full heart. Those words help to understand what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's entire interpretation is. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's entire premise is that without those dots, we would have understood this kiss as the kiss of a begrudging enemy who has to kiss his antagonist. And now that we know that, we understand how Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai understands this pasuk, that the dots weaken the entire message of Vayishlach rather than just the word of kiss. And lastly, that will also explain why he chose this opinion, not the Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar opinion, but the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai opinion. And he told us it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Why? Because there's something about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's methodology of how he learns Torah, where he always looks not just at translation, but always as meaning behind the translation, to understand the translation better. Rabbi Shimon Dorish Taimid Dikra, Rabbi Shimon's famous approach is, why did the pasuk say what it says? In other words, it's not good enough just to see the words and learn something from the words. You always have to understand the words based on the contextual understanding of why these words are there. Why is it Vayishlach hu, not just the meaning of the word kiss? So the first opinion says the meaning of the word kiss, weakened by the dots. Rabbi Shimon says, Taimei Dikro, what's going on over here? Vayishlach hu, Eisav, who hates Yaakov, is kissing him, but we're going to diminish that hatred in this particular kiss. That's what he's explaining here. Here the dots come to reduce, not to take away from the literal meaning of kissing. As the first interpretation said, Vayishlach means it's not actually kissing. Because Rabbi Shimon would say, well then what's the difference who it is? Vayishlach hu is not relevant. Rabbi Shimon follows his shita, which is you always dig down into the context. The context is it's Eisav kissing Yaakov. The dots come to tell us, but this is not Eisav as you normally know him. In other words, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is emphasizing in this context, which is the kiss of Eisav to Yaakov. Rabbi Shimon Dorish Taimei Dikro. Rabbi Shimon looks into what's going on behind the scenes of the word kiss. From which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai points out this is a kiss shared by an enemy. Then come along the dots, weaken that and say he's an enemy, but not right now. Beautiful explanation, except Omnom. There's something still lacking in this interpretation. We have to have rules that are consistent. Anywhere else in the Torah where there are dots on words, we use those dots to weaken the meaning of the word. It would be a real stretch to say, except this case. This case, the dots don't weaken the meaning of the word, but the meaning of the context within which the word appears. And actually, it makes the word stronger than we would have thought. Not only did he kiss him, but he kissed him b'chol liboy. How would Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai suggest such a thing? And then we'll just throw out three other points that we have to pay attention to before we can start to explain what's going on over here. Why do we have to know that it's the brisa of the Sifri that Rashi is referring to? Sifri is a good source. We don't have to know the nuance of which part of Sifri it is. Why do we have to know it's a halacha that Eisav hates Yaakov? We could just say, what's relevant over here is to know that it's clear Eisav hates Yaakov. We don't have to know that there's an halachic status to it. Why does Rashi tell us that? And almost every version of the Sifri says that Eisav's emotions switched, they pivoted. Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi is quoting the Sifri, but borrowing words from the Medrash, that his compassion was aroused. Why is that important? Okay, so quite a lot of stuff that we have to try and unpack. And in order to do that, what the Rebbe is going to do for us is totally shift what Rashi is addressing. Up until now, we believed that Rashi is addressing the dots above the letters, and therefore, depending on this principle of dots weakening the normal interpretation of the letters, either you're going to say that tells us this kiss was insincere, or you're going to do the more convoluted approach of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai as we've explained it so far, which is, well, it's the context that is being weakened. The Rebbe is going to tell us it's not actually what bothers Rashi over here. That's not what instigates this whole conversation. When we work out what is driving the conversation, everything about Rashi's message will shift in our minds. Rashi, not here and pretty much not anywhere, is looking to resolve specifically the letters. Commotion is brought Kameh. We've noted this. The Rebbe says many times that Rashi and Mephorash says Rashi doesn't interpret every single time there are dots on words in the Torah. Therefore, the principle of what role dots play in the Torah, as well as missing or extra letters, words that are spelled out with a vav, without a vav, with a yud, without a yud, those are not things that bother us at the pshat level. And if you're trying to interpret the pshat, you actually don't have to get into these conversations. But if you're in a place where, as it is, the pshat of the story doesn't seem to make sense, and then in the course of explaining what doesn't make sense, Rashi also addresses either the dots or the extra vav or the missing vav, etc. He'll be doing that to help us get a clearer picture of the simple meaning of the pasuk. Rashi is primarily driven over here to answer a glaring question in the pshat of this story. We know who we're dealing with. How did it happen? How did Eisav suddenly shed his normal persona and become this cuddly, loving man? To his brother Yaakov. We already know from the end of Parshas Vayetze that he's got this heavy grudge against Yaakov. And therefore he wants to kill him. And the messengers that Yaakov sent to scout Esav's approach come back to say, he still hates you. And he's on his way in this particular interaction to fight against Yaakov with 400 vigilantes, 400 mercenaries. What changed? That's what's bothering Rashi and should bother any thinking person who reads this parasha. Therefore Rashi explains the fact that he embraced him is really an unusual occasion. Something touched him. What touched him? He saw Yaakov bowing and bowing, touched him, and therefore he hugged him. Nobody's going to debate that. Everybody agrees that's the simplest way to understand the pasuk. Yaakov did something to touch the soul of Eisav, and Eisav responded. He hugged him. But when you get to the next point, that he kissed him, and you think, hang on a second, kissing somebody? That's not just showing the kind of love between people where you're willing to hug and embrace somebody. And that actually indicates a very active, very advanced kind of love. He's not only saying I love you, he's not only showing him a beautiful hug, and he kisses him. And a child who's learned Chumash knows what a kiss means. A child knows from personal experience the advantage over a kiss has over a hug. It's like Atzmai from his own experience of a Yachsam Shal Horav love from his parents, the difference between his parents giving him a hug and his parents giving him a kiss. How did that happen to? We get it. So Eisav is touched enough that he's emotionally wants to give his brother a hug. But a kiss? Now it's no longer logical to say it was just a response to Yaakov's gestures. That would never be enough to transform Eisav from one extreme, the hater who's ready to murder his brother, to the guy who's kissing his brother. And that from hatred and a willingness to murder his brother, he's now going to show so much love. And not only will he show him love, but love that says a hug isn't enough and I have to do more. That's what's bothering Rashi. What twigged in Esav's brain? Rashi says to understand that we're going to have to look at the nakudas. We don't look at nakudas unless there's something in the pshat that it will help us to understand. Nakudolav. But these dots are relevant to understanding the simple understanding of the pasuk. And it's going to fit the same system of any time there are dots and words right across the Torah. That it is a weakened version of what's being described. And therefore the first place Rashi goes is to say the kiss actually wasn't sincere. It may look amazing for the cameras, but it wasn't actually sincere. But what a kiss from Eisav that is not sincere looks like, that is a matter of debate, and both sides of the debate are equally valid according to Pshat. Rashi explains. There are two views. The fact that this is not a true kiss, there are two valid ways to explain why and how that is. One opinion is, it was completely insincere. Even though he was awakened to have a sense of compassion because of the gestures that Yaakov made by bowing to him, And eventually, not only did Hagim, he kissed him as well. The Hag was true, was sincere. The Rachamim was sincere. By the time I got to the kiss, it was no longer sincere. First opinion. But then there's another opinion. Actually, the arousal of compassion was so strong that the kiss was genuine. After he hugged him, of which was the response from him awakening this love. What Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying, at the time that he hugged his brother, that aroused deeper compassion. He suddenly became filled with this warmth towards his brother, which prompted him to actually then kiss his brother, which he never expected to do, and genuinely. So why is it then part of the same pshat that it's not sincere? Because it was only in the heat of the moment. It's not Eisav as Eisav is, it's Eisav in that experience. Now, Rashi has to clarify for us and highlight for us that even Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who sounds like he's giving Eisav a lot of credit for a sincere kiss, actually is not saying it's that sincere. Rashi has to prove that. And therefore, as we've already explained, that the nikud is not to weaken the word Vayishlach in the classical sense that this kiss was not sincere, but rather that his attitude wasn't consistently this kiss. So therefore, that's why Rashi says, before we get to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, let's just remind ourselves that it's a halacha, Eisav hates Yaakov. That is the consistent value. Halacha mashma also din. Halacha is law. Laws are immutable. And a child understands a child even without having learned Mishnah Gemara. You know, rules are rules. They don't change. The child knows this because he knows the rules of Judaism are immutable rules. We don't switch out Shabbos because there's a big ball game. That's Rashbi's opinion. The inherent absolute hatred that Eisav has to Yaakov cannot change. It's a halacha. This axiom that Eisav hates Yaakov is as solid as a halacha that can never change. But he's kissing him here. That was an aberration. It was a breakdown on Eisav's part. He's not being Eisav at this point. But Eisav's suddenly feeling compassion. And by the way, halacha works that way too. There's an immutable halacha, and then there are circumstances. Sometimes you can have a temporary application of a law which is against halacha. The most famous example, of course, Eliyahu Navi bringing a korban outside of the Beis Hamikdash and Har HaKarmel to deal with the prophets of Baal. It's not allowed, but you accommodate it for a specific circumstance. It's not that the halacha has changed, the halacha remains. You cannot make a bama outside of the Beis Hamikdash. But it's possible that while the rule is in place, one may not bring a korban on a bama outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Eliyahu is allowed to for this particular emergency. In fact, you see it in Yaakov's behavior too. Yaakov was a man of integrity and sincerity. But when Eisav spent his whole life fooling his father that he's a good guy, and therefore, that convinced Yitzchak to want to give Eisav the brachas. Because he successfully convinced his father that he was so vigilant about mitzvahs. Then Yaakov says, okay, I've got to temporarily not be the ishtam, and I've got to also be conniving. But it's not regular corruption or cheating. It's the kind of thing that elicits brachas. As Rashi tells us, or as Unklis tells us, that the mirma over here is sly, it's wisdom, it's insight. The point being that you can have a status with an aberration in the status, it doesn't undermine the status. So the status is Eisav hates Yaakov. Right now, there's an aberration. He's kissing him wholeheartedly. That helps us to understand all of the questions that we asked. Aleph. That's why Rashi didn't choose to quote the two opinions in Avos Rabbi Nassan, which is more concise. Where the one opinion says it's not a true kiss, and the other says it is a true kiss. No, because Rashi's view is that even Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who says doesn't mean it was a true expression of the love that a kiss would convey. Because truth doesn't change. The debate between the two opinions is just, what does it mean? How deep was the insincerity of this kiss? The first opinion is, but even in the moment it was completely insincere. Rashbi says, no, there was an aberration over here. There was a temporary glimpse of an Eisav who could love Yaakov. But because the halacha reinstates the status quo, which is that actually Eisav completely hates Yaakov, even in that moment, it's not the truth of Eisav, it's the truth of the moment. Also, why didn't Rashi quote verbatim from the Sifri that his feelings were transposed into compassion? Because that would imply that Esav's hatred was converted into compassion, and that didn't happen. Rashi wants to make it clear that at the very best case scenario, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's opinion, his compassion was aroused, but his temperament wasn't transformed, his character wasn't transformed. He had this flutter in his heart at that particular time of compassion and love, and that spilled out into this kiss. Also, we now understand why Rashi specifically told us where this is from, not just Sifri, but Braisa de Sifri. Why is that? Gimel Rashi hiktim v'kosav shadvarim nemu b'Braisa de Sifri. You look at Sifri, you think of Sifri in the context of Medrash. Medrash is not always so absolutely literal. So yes, halacha b'yodua is maybe a turn of phrase that we know Eisav hates us. In other words, the conclusion of all our analysis of Eisav comes to the conclusion he absolutely hates us, almost to the point as if it were a halacha. Rashi says, no. This was written in the Braisa of Sifri, meaning that is the part of commentary that is halachic in nature. It's not a medrash which is perhaps a little bit grey for some people. It is a binding legal principle. Eisav that Eisav hates Yaakov, and therefore it's immutable. And therefore, if in the moment Eisav has this rush of love, it's not who he really is, it's just an experience he's had. Still, another question. What's pushing Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai to argue for Eisav? The first opinion is great. He was insincere. We relate to it. It makes sense in Pshat. Why is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai looking to defend Eisav? Where is there anything in the Pshat that indicates that there was any sincerity in Eisav? As Rashbi himself introduces his comment by saying that it's a legal principle, it's an axiom that Eisav hates Yaakov. The next thing you'd expect out of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's mouth is, and so too here, it was an insincere kiss to his brother. The explanation is, again, context. Read the context of this encounter, and you see that Eisav is in an incredibly emotional state, probably something he could never have anticipated. The pasuk says it. After he kissed him, says they cried. Do you see Eisav as a man who cries? Says that's an incredible outpouring of emotion. And look at what Eisav says to Yaakov afterwards. Which Rashi says he acknowledges that the brachas belong to Yaakov. Look what's happening with Eisav. And then he says, let me give you some people to assist you on your way, and let's travel together. In that context of this incredible behavior from Eisav that nobody would have anticipated, it is actually difficult to accept that this was all just a show. Eisav had no intention of actually any of it. And that's what prompts Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai to say, you know what, something was happening internally with Eisav at that point that arose compassion. Yes, it was fleeting, but it was actually there in the moment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes when you have two commentaries on a single pasuk and we want to say that they are equally valid, it's not only because each one is equally valid in the pshat, it's also because each one may have a weak point and therefore they kind of balance each other. Now we understand what Rashi is saying. Yesh cholkin. There are two equal valid perspectives on this. Because the weakness is an equal weakness in either pirush. The first proposal, which says he was completely insincere. Eisav had no strand of sincerity in his kiss to Yaakov. How does he fit that in with all the outpouring of emotion and reconciliation that follows? Which all seems to show that there was some sincerity in Eisav, because now he wants to help Yaakov and acknowledge the brachas, etc. So the weak point of that opinion doesn't fit the context so perfectly. Whereas the weak point in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's argument is, yes, the context of what follows suits your suggestion that this is a sincere kiss, but what about the context of everything else about Eisav where he normally hates him? And so they both have an equal weakness. The context doesn't support their pirush completely. So everybody's happy at this point because we've explained why Vayichabkehu is explained the one way, Vayishlach the two opinions, why the two opinions have to be the same, why Rashi uses the words of the Sifri, why he tells us it's Bryce at the Sifri, why Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is defending the possible sincerity of Eisav, at least in the moment. But if you're really on the ball and a sharp student, you still have a question. Safe. Let's be honest. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the one who drew our attention to the seething, enduring animosity of Eisav to Yaakov. How does he land up being the person, Dafka, who tells us that actually in that moment Eisav kissed him sincerely? Let somebody else say it. Rashi alludes to the answer to that question by saying, do you realize who's saying this? Not just, it happens to be this rabbi. What happened in his life? Who is he? What was his experience? What was his personal engagement with Eisav's descendants? Because that's going to be really insightful. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Eisav hu Edom. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai lived in the time of the Roman Empire, who are direct descendants of Eisav. At a time where there were terribly difficult challenges against the Jewish people, decrees by the Roman government. And he suffered personally. To the point that he had to run away and hide in a cave for 13 years. If there's anybody who should think that the Romans, the Edom, Eisav, are the worst of the worst, it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Yet the Gemara tells us, wild story. There was a time that the Romans wanted to ban Shabbos and Milah and Mikveh. So and they had to choose a delegation to go repeal the decree. They chose Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, enemy of the state. They chose him to go to Rome to petition on behalf of the Jewish people. In regards to the fact that there was this horrific attitude of anti-Semitism and personal hatred to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, not only did Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai go, but he actually miraculously got them to repeal the decree, or they actually got to rip up the decree. Basically, the Gemara tells a crazy story. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is on the way to Rome. He meets up this demon, and he says, wow, Hagar was met by Malachim when she went away from home. And all I could get was a demon. Okay, but the Eibusher will make a nace through the demon as well. They get to Rome. The demon possesses the daughter of the ruler. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, okay, I'll daven, and she'll be cured. Which happens. At that point, the ruler says, come with me to my treasure house, right? Whatever you want to ask, come, I'll take you to my treasure house, you can have whatever you want. So they said, let's have a look around. They found the decree, they ripped up the decree. Who brings Rome to its knees in this particular story? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. In other words, the same Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who you would expect to stay miles away from Rome is able to work with Rome. And that is why Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai could explain that something like that happens with Yaakov and Eisav. Look, the Roman emperor, he changes. Yaakov is also somebody who is Melumad ben Nisim. Rashi tells us, and he threw his stick down and he split the Yarden in order to cross. Nisim come easy to him, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He could have an impact on Eisav, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai could have an impact on the Roman emperor, despite their endemic hatred, to temporarily have this arousal of compassion and kiss him wholeheartedly. And this is exactly how Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai operates. It's a very paradoxical reality, but it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's reality. We know what Chassidus explains Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We know the very famous story when Rabbi Shimon and his son came out of the cave after 12 years. Rabbi Loza looked around and he couldn't handle the fact that people were steeped in materialism, and he caused devastation wherever he looked. Wherever he caused devastation, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai revived and rejuvenated what he had destroyed, and then they had to go back into the cave and calibrate. Say there's a masi Rabbi Shimon. In other words, this attitude of rejuvenating and helping and healing the world, that is the appropriate way that you're supposed to behave within the context of the world. Not to follow Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's primary focus, which is escape the world, be completely immersed in Torah learning to the exclusion of all else. Rabbi Loza is coming from the perspective of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Pristine, absolute, just dedicated to Torah. All these people are crazy for being invested in the world, and therefore they deserve whatever Rabbi Loza did to them. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who himself could live at that level of Torah Nasa, completely disengaged from the world, is the same Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who could heal the world. The world, as the world operates, could be dealt with and guided by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And the same principle, only at a higher scale, is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's famous line, I could carry all of the negative judgment that might be deserving for the world. I could take it all on and prevent any of the tsuras. So if Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is going to neutralize any negativity that's aimed at the world, that doesn't mean he's going to make them all tzaddikim, because then there'd be no negativity. It means a world which is imperfect. It means where people are engaged in improper things. Nevertheless, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is powerful enough to take on and absorb, so to speak, all of their stuff, so that they could be free of any retribution. If you think about it, in a certain regard, being able to absorb the difficulty or imperfections of the world is actually more of an impact than changing the world. When you change the world, it's no longer world. In other words, it's no longer in its natural state. And that obviously means you completely eradicate all negativity, because you've transformed the world. Rashbi is saying something else. Godliness is powerful enough that it can help and affect and bring value to an imperfect world. When the world is still lowly, right? And when the negative of the world is still where it, so to speak, belongs. That's exactly what's happening with Yaakov and Eisav. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is emphasizing Yaakov doesn't transform Eisav. That's not the chiddush of this story. It will happen later in history. It's not the chiddush of this story. It is Eisav in his unrefined, lowly, crass form of hatred for the Jewish people at all times. Even that Eisav could have this temporary experience of compassion and kiss Yaakov with fullness of heart. And that's going to teach us a massive lesson. The lesson for living in Golus is primarily the Golus of Edom, and it's actually in two paradoxical realities. Eisav hates us. Bottom line, don't get too reliant. Malchus Edom. If they don't like us, don't think that any magic is going to happen. On the But that doesn't mean we can't change, we can't have an impact on them. Even the unrefined Eisav could have moments of compassion and true love for us. To help us do what we need to do and give us everything we need. That they, the Eisav nations, will be the ones who help us, the Jewish people, achieve our objectives with full force. But the only way we get there, the only way we get the Eisav to be loving and supportive, is we have to stand absolutely firm in Torah mitzvahs during Golus. And we are not fazed at all by the fact that there are other people or other modes of thinking. And we say it straight. I was in a place of Lavan and I kept all the 613 mitzvahs, which basically means we proudly stand up and say we're Jewish people living in non-Jewish lands, observing Jewish life. And it's for everybody's benefit, not something to be ashamed of. And that will bring to the fulfillment of the prophecy in the Haftarah this week, which is the message to Edom. And by who? By Ovadia, who is the manifestation, he is the anthropomorphosis of that transformation of Eisav, because he is an Edomite who became a ger. The expression goes, you use wood to create the axe, to chop down the tree. How does that prophecy conclude? That those who are the saviors will go to the mountain of Eisav, and the Eibishter will be in control of the whole world, or at least in a revealed way. That's already alluded to in this parasha. That after Eisav kissed Yaakov, what did he say? He said, let's go, let's travel together. And Yaakov agreed. He just said, not immediately. I'll get you, I'll meet you. As Rashi tells us, I'll catch up to you in the time of Mashiach. We should see the fulfillment of that prophecy and of that transformation of Eisav and the clear manifestation of the Eibishter's rule over the entire world with the coming of Mashiach, mamash now.